The cake hit the bottom of the trash can with a sound I still hear sometimes when a room goes quiet the wrong way. A wet, flat sound. 22 people watching. My mother-in-law's hand halfway to her mouth. My own father staring at his plate like it had personally offended him. And my wife, Renata, standing there in the kitchen light with white buttercream still on 2 of her fingers, laughing. Not a nervous laugh. Not an embarrassed laugh. A real one, easy and bright, the kind of laugh you give when something is genuinely funny to you. "Oh, come on," she said, wiping her fingers on a dish towel. "It's a cake, Marcus. You're 41, not 7. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask her what was wrong with her. I picked up my water glass, took a sip, and said, "You're right. It's just a cake." Then I finished my dinner, thanked her parents for coming, said goodnight to my own father, and went upstairs to my office at 9:40 p.m. By midnight, Renata had 87 missed calls on her phone. None of them were from me. Before I tell you how her phone ended up ringing like that, let me tell you who I am and how we got to that kitchen. My name is Marcus Whitfield. I'm 41 years old. I run Whitfield Development Group out of an office on South Tryon Street in uptown Charlotte, North Carolina, 12 floors up, glass on 3 sides, a view of the skyline I helped build pieces of over the last 16 years. We do mixed-use commercial development, retail corridors, boutique office space, the occasional adaptive reuse project where we take an old textile mill or a warehouse nobody wanted and turn it into something that pays its own way. I started the company at 26 with a construction loan I personally guaranteed and a business plan I'd written on the back of restaurant placemats. Today we manage a portfolio worth just north of $210 million. I tell you the number not to impress you, but because it matters later. Everything in this story eventually comes back to a number. I grew up outside of Gastonia, about 20 minutes from where I live now, the son of a man named Earl Whitfield who spent 34 years as a union carpenter and never once, in my entire childhood, raised his voice in anger. My father had a saying he used more than any other: measure twice, cut once. He didn't just mean lumber. He meant everything. Every decision, every conversation, every reaction. Think before you cut, because wood doesn't grow back. I met Renata Colson 9 years ago at a ribbon cutting for a retail strip I developed in South End. She was 29, working as an event coordinator for the company that had catered the opening, and she had this way of moving through a crowded room like she already knew everyone in it was going to like her. She was right, usually. People did like her. I liked her. I liked her a lot. She was sharp about details, table settings, lighting, the small things most people don't notice until they're wrong. She told me that night she'd always wanted to run her own design studio, something between event styling and interior design, and I remember thinking, watching her talk about it, that I recognized the look on her face. It was the same look I probably had at 26 with my placemat business plan. I understood ambition. I'd built my whole life around respecting it in other people. We dated for a year and a half. I proposed at the top of a building I developed, the first one that was really mine, because it felt right to ask her to build a life with me somewhere I'd already proven I could build something that lasted. We got married at a vineyard outside Asheville. Her parents came up from Columbia. My father gave a toast that made half the room cry, mostly because Earl Whitfield does not give toasts easily, and everyone in that room knew it. 2 years into the marriage, Renata told me she wanted to open her own studio, full interior design and home staging, working with builders and homeowners across the Charlotte area. I told her what I've told every person I've ever believed in: don't worry about the money, focus on the work, I've got the rest. I funded the build-out of her flagship studio on East Boulevard. $240,000 for the lease, the renovation, the showroom furniture, the initial staff. Because the studio was structured as an LLC and I was the one who capitalized it, my attorney set it up the way she sets up everything, cleanly, with paperwork that protected both of us. I held a 51% ownership stake. Renata held 49% and ran day-to-day operations as creative director. It was her name on the door, Rennie Company, but it was, on paper and in practice, something we owned together, weighted slightly in my favor because that's how you protect an investment when you're the one writing checks. I never thought about that percentage as a weapon. For 6 years, I never thought about it at all. The studio did well. Better than well. By year 4, Rennie Company had contracts with 3 regional homebuilders and a waiting list for private clients. Renata was good at it, genuinely good, not just well-funded. I want to be fair about that, because fairness matters to how this story ends. The studio's growth mattered to me for reasons beyond the money, too. I'd grown up watching my father build things with his hands and hand them over to someone else's name on the building permit. He was proud of his work, but he never once got to put his own name on anything he built. Funding Renata's studio felt, in some private way I never said out loud, like a version of building something that could carry a name all the way through, no middleman, no contractor stamp that wasn't yours. Watching Rennie Company grow from a single lease storefront into a name 3 regional builders trusted felt like watching an investment pay off in a currency that had nothing to do with return percentages. That's part of why what happened later cut as deep as it did. It wasn't just a marriage unraveling. It was watching something I'd believed in the fullest sense of that word, get used as cover for something else. Somewhere around year 5, though, I started noticing the kind of small things that don't mean anything on their own and mean everything once you have enough of them stacked up. She started taking a consultant named Preston Cole to client walkthroughs. Preston did brand marketing and social media strategy, and Renata talked about him constantly at first. Preston thinks we should reposition the studio, Preston says our Instagram engagement is soft, Preston has an idea for the spring campaign. Then, somewhere around month 3 of Preston Cole existing in our conversations, she stopped mentioning him at all. Not because he'd disappeared. Because she'd started keeping him separate from the parts of her life she still shared with me. Her phone started living face down on counters. She'd take calls on the back porch with the door closed, even in February. She stopped asking me about my projects, which was strange, because for 6 years she'd been the person I talked through every deal with. She had a good eye for how a space would feel to walk through, and I valued that. And then one day she just didn't ask anymore, the way you stop watching a show you used to love without ever deciding to stop. There were other things, smaller and stranger, that only made sense to me later, once I had a full picture. She started dressing differently for client walkthroughs, nothing dramatic, just more deliberate, the kind of small upgrade in effort you notice in someone only because you've watched them get dressed for the same kind of Tuesday 100 times before. She started referring to the studio's growth in the first-person singular more than she used to, not we landed the Ashford contract but I landed the Ashford contract, even in conversations where I knew, because I'd seen the invoices, that Preston Cole's strategy work had been part of how that contract came together. She stopped inviting me to the studio's client events, small dinners and walkthroughs I used to be a regular, minor presence at, always introduced as my husband. He's the one who made this place possible. Somewhere in year 5, I quietly became someone she didn't bring along anymore. None of it, on its own, would have told a stranger anything. Together, laid end to end across 6 months, it told me a story I didn't want to read but couldn't stop reading once I'd started. I noticed all of it. I filed all of it away. And I did not confront her, for the same reason I don't walk into a negotiation before I understand the other side's position. Confrontation without information is just noise, and I don't make noise. I watch. I gather. I wait until I know more than the other person thinks I know, and then I decide what to do with that advantage. So I watched Renata plan my 41st birthday dinner at our house in Myers Park, inviting both families, ordering a cake from the same bakery she'd used for every occasion in our marriage, and I let her do it, because I wanted to see what the evening would show me. It showed me more than I expected. The dinner started fine. Her parents arrived at 6, my father at 6:15, looking, as he always does at these things, like a man patiently waiting for the part of the evening where he can go home. We ate. Renata was in a mood I can only describe as untethered, laughing loudly at things that weren't especially funny, refilling her wine more than usual, making little comments about how I live in spreadsheets and wouldn't know a good time if it staged an intervention. Her mother laughed along. Her father, a quiet man who sells insurance in Colombia, mostly stared at his plate. I let it go. I've built a career on letting small things go so I can respond to the large ones with clear eyes. Then it was time for the cake. Renata carried it out herself, 3 tiers, white with gold leaf detail, the kind of cake that costs $400 because someone spent 11 hours on it. Everyone sang. I blew out the candles. And then, as I reached for the cake server, Renata picked the whole cake up off the counter, walked it 3 steps to the kitchen trash can, and dropped it in. The room went silent in the specific way a room goes silent when everyone present is doing rapid math on whether what they just saw actually happened. "Oh, come on," she said, and laughed. "It's a cake, Marcus. You're 41, not 7. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I've been accused since then of not feeling anything, and that's not true. I felt something sharp and specific, a kind of clean, cold recognition, not of the cake, which genuinely didn't matter to me, but of what the cake represented. 22 people in that room, and my wife had just decided, in front of every one of them, that humiliating me publicly was worth more to her than whatever this dinner was supposed to be. You don't do that to someone you're still building a life with. You do that to someone you've already, quietly, in some room in your head I wasn't invited into, decided to leave. I picked up my water glass. I took a sip. I said, "You're right. It's just a cake." And then I finished dinner like nothing had happened, because reacting in that kitchen, in front of both our families, would have handed Renata exactly what she seemed to be fishing for, a scene she could later describe as me overreacting, me embarrassing her, me being the difficult one. I've spent 16 years in rooms with people trying to bait me into a bad decision. I know what it looks like. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction. I thanked her parents for coming at 9:15. I hugged my father goodnight at 9:30, and he held onto my shoulder a half-second longer than usual, which from Earl Whitfield is the equivalent of another man weeping openly. He didn't say anything about the cake. He didn't have to. I could see him doing his own version of measuring twice. At 9:40, I went upstairs to my office, closed the door, and sat down at my desk. I didn't call Renata's name. I didn't slam anything. I opened my laptop and pulled up the operating agreement for Rennie Company, the one my attorney had drafted 6 years earlier, the one that gave me 51% ownership and, buried in Section 9, full authority over any capital account, line of credit, or vendor agreement backed by my personal guarantee. I made 3 calls that night. I want to walk you through each one, because I think the order matters. The first call was to my attorney, a woman named Colleen Ashby who has represented Whitfield Development for 11 years and has never once, in all that time, asked me why I wanted something done, only how fast. She picked up on the second ring. It was 9:47 on a Friday night, which tells you something about the kind of relationship I have with the people I trust. "Marcus. What's going on?" I told her. Not with any heat in my voice, just the facts, laid out the way I'd lay out a deal summary. The dinner. The cake. 6 months of small changes I'd been tracking. The name Preston Cole, which I said out loud for the first time to another person that night. Colleen was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What do you want to do?" "I want to pull my capital from Rennie and Company. Tonight, if it's possible. I want the line of credit frozen and I want the studio's vendor accounts that I personally guarantee suspended pending review. You know that's going to shut the studio down inside of a week if she can't cover it independently. I know exactly what it's going to do, Colleen. That's why I'm calling you and not calling her." She didn't argue with me. That's not who Colleen is. She said she'd have the paperwork moving by morning and that she could get the credit line frozen with the bank first thing when they opened, since it was Friday night and nothing formal would process until Monday regardless, but she could get the informal holds in place immediately, the kind that would start generating decline transaction notifications the moment anyone tried to use the accounts. The second call was to my accountant, a sharp, unshakable woman named Priya Anand who had handled Whitfield Development's books since year 2 of the company and, by extension, had set up the financial architecture of Rennie Company as well. I asked her to pull together a full accounting of every draw against the studio's line of credit over the last 6 months, every transaction, every vendor, every dollar. Looking for something specific? She asked. I'll know it when I see it. I already suspected what I'd find. A consultant doesn't usually work for free, and Preston Cole's invoices, I was fairly certain, had been running through the studio's books the entire time, paid for, in effect, by me. The third call I made was to my father. It was after 10 by then. Earl Whitfield goes to bed at 9:30 most nights and gets up at 5, so I almost didn't call. But something in me needed to hear his voice more than I needed him to be well rested. He picked up on the fourth ring, sounding like a man who'd been asleep for exactly long enough to be annoyed about it. Marcus. Everything all right? No, I said. But I'm handling it. I told him what happened at dinner, the cake, the laugh, the 22 witnesses. He didn't say anything for a long stretch, long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. Then he said, "You didn't say anything to her at the table." No. Good, he said. You don't swing a hammer while you're still figuring out where the stud is. You'll put a hole in the wall for nothing. He paused. What are you doing about it? I'm pulling my stake out of the studio. Freezing the accounts. Starting tonight. Another pause, longer this time. My father built things his whole life. He understands, better than almost anyone I know, the difference between tearing something down out of anger and removing your support from something that was never structurally sound to begin with. Is this about the money, he asked, or is this about something else? It's about the fact that she stood in our kitchen in front of both our families and threw away something I paid for because it was funny to her to humiliate me. And it's about 6 months of things before that I think that cake was actually about. He was quiet again. Then, do it clean. Don't do it angry. There's a difference, and everybody can tell which one it was after the fact, even if it looks the same in the moment. I know, Dad. I know you know. I'm saying it anyway, because that's what fathers do. I hung up a few minutes after 11. I sat at my desk and didn't do anything else that night. No more calls, no drafting angry emails, nothing. I poured 2 fingers of the bourbon I keep in the office cabinet for nights that require thinking clearly rather than feeling anything, and I waited. By 11:50, the informal holds Colleen had arranged were live. The studio's business debit card, tied to the line of credit I guaranteed, declined at a printing company Renata used for signage. It declined again 40 minutes later when someone, I assume Preston, though I never confirmed it, tried to run a dinner reservation through the studio's corporate card at a restaurant downtown. At 11:58, my phone buzzed. Not a call. A text from Renata, "Why is my card not working?" I didn't answer. By midnight, according to what I was told later, Renata had 87 missed calls stacked up on her phone, her bank, her studio manager, 2 vendors, Preston Cole calling repeatedly, and, near the top of the pile, several calls from her own mother, who I can only assume Renata had called in a panic and who had then tried calling back once Renata stopped picking up, caught in her own small storm of confusion about what was happening to her daughter's business in real time on a Friday night. None of the 87 calls were from me. I hadn't called her once. I didn't need to. The paperwork was doing the talking, the way my father taught me it should. She came home at 1:20 in the morning. I heard her car in the driveway, heard the garage door, heard her heels on the hardwood coming up the stairs faster than usual. She opened the office door without knocking. "My card is declining everywhere," she said. "The studio's line of credit is frozen." "What did you do?" I closed my laptop slowly. "I made some calls tonight." "Marcus. What did you do?" "I pulled my capital from Rennie and Company," I said. "I'm the 51% owner, Renata." I have that right, and as of tonight, I've exercised it. She stared at me the way you stare at someone who has just told you something in a language you understand perfectly but still can't quite process. Because I threw out a cake. Because you threw out a cake in front of both our families and laughed while you did it, I said. And because that cake was the loudest version of something I've been watching happen quietly for 6 months. You didn't just embarrass me tonight, Renata. You told me, in the clearest way you've told me anything in a year, exactly where I stand with you. I believe people when they show me who they are. Tonight you showed me. This is insane. You're punishing me over a joke. It wasn't a joke to you. I watched your face. You meant it. I kept my voice level, the same voice I use across a negotiating table when the other side has just overplayed their hand. And I think you meant it because somewhere in the last 6 months, you decided I don't matter to you the way I used to. I think Preston Cole has something to do with that decision. I haven't confirmed it, but I will. Her face changed then, not shame, not yet, but the specific flicker of someone realizing the floor they thought was solid has a soft spot in it. You don't know what you're talking about. Then explain the studio's vendor ledger to me tomorrow, I said. Priya's pulling 6 months of transactions. If I'm wrong about what I'll find in it, I'll apologize and we'll rebuild the credit line by Monday afternoon. If I'm right, we're not having a conversation about a cake anymore. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, arms crossed, and something in her posture shifted from anger towards something closer to fear, the particular fear of someone realizing the person across from them already has more information than they've been given credit for. You've been watching me, she said quietly. 4 months. I've been paying attention, I said. There's a difference, though I understand why it doesn't feel that way to you right now. I didn't hire anyone. I didn't go through your phone. I just noticed things, the way you notice things about a deal that's about to go bad, the small tells before the big collapse. I didn't want to believe what I was noticing. I kept waiting for you to tell me something that made it make sense. You never did. So instead of asking me, you built a case. I asked you tonight, I said. In this room, right now. What exactly did Preston sponsor, Renata? What specifically was worth 6 months of distance and a cake in a trash can in front of both our families? She didn't answer that directly. It's not as simple as you're making it sound. It rarely is, I said. But simple or not, I still get to decide what I fund and what I don't. That's not punishment. That's just where the line actually is, and it turns out it was always right there, waiting for a night like tonight to show up. You could have just talked to me. Before all this. Before the accounts, before the lawyer. I could have, I agreed. But talking to you 6 months ago would have meant confronting you with suspicion instead of certainty, and you would have had every opportunity to explain it away, the way you're trying to explain it away right now. I don't negotiate from a position of doubt if I can help it. I never have. That's not cruelty, Renata. That's just how I've survived 16 years in a business that eats people who move before they're ready. She didn't say anything else that night. She went to the guest room. I sat in my office until nearly 3 in the morning, not because I needed to think anymore, I'd already decided everything that mattered, but because some decisions need a quiet room around them before you can fully believe you made them. Priya sent me the ledger at 8:15 the next morning, a Saturday, which tells you how seriously she took the request. Over the previous 6 months, Rennie Company had paid Preston Cole Consulting $11,400 for brand strategy services. The studio had also covered 2 client dinners that, cross-referenced against the calendar, corresponded to nights Renata told me she was working late alone. And there was a wire transfer, 3 months earlier, for $6,000 to a boutique hotel in Wilmington, coded in the books as off-site strategy retreat, staff of 2. Staff of 2. The studio employed 4 full-time designers and 2 part-time assistants. Renata went to Wilmington with exactly 1 other person. I called Colleen at 9 and told her to proceed with the formal capital withdrawal and to have the paperwork ready to dissolve my ownership stake entirely, with an option to convert it into a straightforward loan repayment structure if Renata wanted to keep the studio running independently. I wasn't trying to burn the business down. The designers who worked there hadn't done anything wrong. I just wasn't going to be the invisible foundation under a company being used, in part, to fund an affair I'd been quietly documenting for months. My sister, Rayanne, showed up at the house around 11 that morning. She runs a marketing agency out of Noda and has a talent for showing up exactly when a person needs someone in the room who isn't going to ask a single unnecessary question. She let herself in with the spare key, set 2 coffees on the kitchen island, and looked at me for a long moment. "Dad called me," she said. "He said you needed company, not advice." That sounds like him. So I'm not giving advice. I'm just here. She slid one of the coffees toward me. "Though for the record, if you wanted advice, I'd tell you that you did the right thing in exactly the right order. Cake first, consequences after. Not the other way around." We sat at the island for a while, not saying much. Rayanne has always understood that some mornings don't need to be filled with talking. "She's going to say you overreacted," Rayanne said eventually. "That's what people do when the actual reaction is smaller than what they expected." "I know. You good?" "I will be." And I meant it, even that morning, even with the dust still settling. Renata came downstairs around noon, and Rayanne quietly took her coffee out to the back patio, giving us the room. Renata looked like she hadn't slept, makeup gone, hair pulled back, wearing sweats instead of the dress from the night before. There was something almost younger about her like that, more like the woman I'd met at a ribbon-cutting 9 years earlier than the one who dropped a cake in a trash can 12 hours before. "I talked to my studio manager this morning," she said, sitting across from me at the island. "She says the vendor accounts are frozen. Payroll runs Tuesday. If this isn't fixed, I can't make it." "I know. You're really going to let my employees not get paid over this?" "I've already spoken to Colleen about structuring a bridge loan so payroll isn't disrupted while we sort out ownership," I said. "The people who work for you didn't do anything to me. I'm not interested in hurting them. I am interested in no longer funding whatever this last 6 months has actually been." She was quiet for a moment. Then, in a smaller voice than I'd heard from her in a long time, "How much do you actually know?" "I know about Wilmington," I said. "I know about the $11,000 in consulting invoices for a man who apparently does more than brand strategy. I know you've been taking his calls on the back porch with the door shut since spring. I know last night, in front of both our families, you threw away a cake because some part of you wanted a reason to blow this up rather than just telling me the truth." She didn't deny any of it. That, more than anything else, told me everything I still needed to know. "It wasn't supposed to go this far," she said. "Preston and it started as work. And then it didn't feel like work anymore, and I didn't know how to tell you, and every month I didn't tell you made it harder to imagine telling you, until it felt easier to just let something blow up than to sit you down and say it out loud. So you threw a cake in a trash can." "I don't know why I did that," she said, and for the first time that morning, her voice cracked. "I think some part of me wanted you to finally react to something. You never react to anything, Marcus. I think I wanted to see if anything could actually get through." I looked at her for a long moment. "I reacted," I said quietly. "You just didn't recognize it, because I don't react the way you expected. I don't yell. I don't throw things. I make calls. I move capital. I protect what's mine and I remove myself from what isn't anymore. That's not nothing, Renata. That's just not loud." She didn't have an answer for that. I want to pause here, because I know how this sounds from the outside. A man pulls hundreds of thousands of dollars of financial support out from under his wife's business over a piece of cake. There's a version of this story where I'm the villain, cold, controlling, turning a marriage into a balance sheet the moment things got uncomfortable. I've thought about that version. I don't think it's true, but I understand why someone watching from a distance might land there. Here's what I know about what actually happened. I didn't freeze those accounts because of a cake. I froze them because 6 months of small, deliberate distance had built up behind that cake, and the cake was simply the moment I finally had enough information, and enough public confirmation of how little I mattered to her in that moment, to act. I didn't do it to destroy Rennie Company. I structured the withdrawal specifically so her staff would still get paid and so the business, if she chose to keep running it independently, could survive without me. I wasn't trying to punish a company. I was removing myself as the quiet foundation under a life I was no longer sure I was actually part of. I've thought a lot, in the months since, about the difference between reacting and responding, because I think it's the whole hinge this story turns on. A reaction happens to you. It's fast, it's loud, and it's usually shaped more by the other person's provocation than by your own judgment, which is exactly why Renata dropped that cake in the trash in the first place. I think some part of her wanted a reaction. I think she'd been waiting months for one, maybe without even admitting that to herself, because a reaction from me would have given her a villain to point to, a reason the marriage failed that didn't require her to sit with her own choices. A response is different. A response takes longer, costs you something to build, and doesn't announce itself in the room where the provocation happened. I gave her a response instead of a reaction, and I think that's the part she genuinely wasn't prepared for, more than the money, more than the studio, more than any of it. She'd built a whole evening around the assumption that I'd finally crack in front of an audience. Instead, I went upstairs and made 3 phone calls, and by the time she understood what those calls meant, there was no audience left to perform for. The filing for divorce went in 9 days later. North Carolina requires a year of separation before a divorce is finalized if you can't agree on terms, but Renata and I, through our attorneys, worked out a separation agreement in about 6 weeks that neither of us contested. I kept my stake in Whitfield Development entirely separate and untouched, since it predated the marriage and had always been structured that way. She kept the house in Myers Park, which had been titled jointly, in exchange for signing over what remained of her interest in Rennie Company, which by then had been restructured as a loan she'd pay back over 4 years rather than an ownership stake I still held. I didn't want to run her business. I never had. I just didn't want to fund it anymore. Preston Cole's consulting contract with the studio ended within the month, not because I demanded it, but because a business running on a repayment schedule instead of a healthy credit line doesn't have room for an $11,000 strategy retainer. What I hadn't known, and only learned later through Rayanne, who runs in overlapping marketing circles in Charlotte, was that Rennie Company had been one of Preston's 2 largest retainer clients, and that he'd been quietly using the relationship, and, I suspect, the access it gave him to a well-funded studio backed by a developer with a wide network, to court 2 other clients in the home-building space who wanted exactly the kind of connections Rennie Company's success had suggested he had. Once the studio's spending contracted and the retainer ended, those introductions dried up along with it. Rayanne heard through a mutual contact that his firm downsized to a one-man operation within the year. I never spoke to him directly, and I never went looking for that outcome. I only mention it because it illustrates something I already believed going in. Very little in that 6 months had been built on anything as solid as it looked from the outside. Not the affair, not the consulting business, not even, in the end, the marriage. I was the foundation under more of it than either of them realized until I stopped being willing to hold it up. He wasn't the one who made vows to me, so I never felt entitled to any accounting from him. Renata was the one who owed me an explanation, and in her own way, over the months that followed, she gave me one. I moved out of the Myers Park house in October and bought a condo on the 17th floor of a building I developed near Uptown, the same one, coincidentally, where I'd proposed to Renata almost a decade earlier. There was something clarifying about that, standing on the balcony my first night there, looking out at a skyline I'd helped shape, in a building I'd built with my own judgment years before I ever met her. Whatever else had changed, that part of my life had never depended on her at all. The next several months were quiet in the specific way that follows a controlled demolition rather than a collapse. I worked. I threw myself into the South End project with a focus I hadn't had in years, not because I was running from anything, but because for the first time in a long while, every hour I spent building something belonged entirely to me. There was no invisible ledger anymore, no quiet accounting of what I was funding for someone else's benefit while getting less and less of myself back in return. It's a strange kind of freedom, realizing how much energy you'd been spending without noticing, and getting all of it back at once. Whitfield Development closed on the 200-unit mixed-use project in South End that had been in the pipeline for years, the biggest deal of my career, closing almost exactly 5 months after the night of the cake. My father came to the ribbon cutting and stood at the edge of the crowd the way he always does, hands in his pockets, quietly proud in a way he'd never say out loud but that you could read on him if you knew what to look for. He walked the finished lobby slowly, running a hand along an exposed timber beam we'd salvaged from the original mill building on the site, and said, "Good bones. You can always tell." Coming from a man who spent 34 years judging exactly that for a living, it meant more to me than any toast at any dinner ever could have. Rayanne brought her whole team from the agency and treated the opening like a client win, which, in a way, it was. She'd handled the launch marketing pro bono, refusing payment, telling me that some things a sister just does. I dated a little, eventually, though nothing serious enough to belong in this story. Mostly I rebuilt the parts of my life that had quietly gone missing over the last 2 years without my noticing, dinners with my father that weren't about anything except being in the same room, weekend trips with Rayanne's family to the lake house our parents still owned outside Gastonia, evenings that belonged to nobody's agenda but my own. I ran into Renata about 8 months after the divorce was finalized, at a coffee shop on South Boulevard on a Tuesday morning, the kind of ordinary encounter neither of us could have planned for. She looked different, not worse, exactly, but smaller in some way I couldn't fully name, like a person still figuring out how much space she was allowed to take up in a life she was rebuilding from a different starting point. "Marcus," she said. "Renata." There was a pause, not an unfriendly one. Just a pause. "How are you?" she asked. "Good," I said, and meant it. "Really good, actually. The South End project closed in the spring. Biggest thing I've ever built. I saw it in the paper." She smiled, a small, honest thing. "I'm proud of you." "I know that's strange to say." "It's not strange," I said. "How's the studio?" "Smaller," she said. "I let 2 designers go, restructured the client list. It's mine now, though. Actually mine, start to finish. I'm still paying you back, by the way. On schedule." "I know. Colleen mentioned it." I paused. "You didn't have to tell me that." "I wanted to," she said. "I think some part of me needed you to know I could actually run it without you funding it. Even if it's smaller. Even if it took losing everything else to figure that out." I nodded. There wasn't anything cruel left in me to say to her, and there hadn't been for a while. "I hope it keeps growing," I said, and I meant that too. "Do you ever think about the cake?" she asked, almost laughing at herself for asking. "Sometimes," I admitted. "Not because of the cake. Because of the look on your face when you dropped it. I think that was the most honest thing you did in the last year of our marriage. Everything else was performance. That wasn't." She didn't argue with that. "I'm sorry," she said. "For the cake. For Wilmington. For all of it, honestly, not just the parts that got caught in a ledger." "I believe you," I said. And I did. "Take care of yourself, Marcus. You too." We went our separate directions on the sidewalk, and that was, more or less, the last real conversation we've had. My name is Marcus Whitfield. I'm 41 years old, 42 now, actually, since another birthday has come and gone since that night, this one considerably quieter, celebrated with my father and Rayanne at a restaurant downtown, no cake thrown anywhere, no audience of 22 people watching to see how I'd respond to being humiliated. I run a development company I built from a construction loan and a stack of restaurant placemats into a $210 million portfolio, and I did it, in the end, the same way I handled the worst night of my marriage: measure twice, cut once, and never let anyone see you swing the hammer in anger. People ask me sometimes why I didn't say anything at that dinner table, why I let Renata drop that cake in the trash and laugh about it in front of both our families without a single word in response. I think they expect me to say I was too stunned to speak, or too proud to give her a reaction. That's not it. I said nothing at that table because I already understood, in the moment the cake left her hands, that words weren't going to be the tool that fixed anything. Some moments call for a raised voice. Most of the moments that actually matter call for something quieter, a decision made carefully, in a room by yourself, with a phone and an attorney and a father who taught you the difference between reacting and responding. Renata wanted a scene that night. I gave her a Saturday morning phone call to a bank instead, and by the time she understood what that meant, the scene she'd been fishing for had already happened, just not in front of an audience, and not on her terms. That's the part one want you to take from this, if you take anything at all. The people who hurt you loudest are usually hoping you'll answer them at the same volume. Don't. Let the silence do the talking. Handle your business quietly, completely, and on your own schedule, and by the time anyone realizes what's happened, there's nothing left to argue about. If this story hit you, let me know in the comments. Have you ever had a moment like that cake, a small thing that told you everything you needed to know about where you actually stood with someone? And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe. We tell real stories here, and we're just getting started.